repelled by his ideas that generated a lot of research. So one of the contributions that he made to intellectual and cultural development is that he stimulated a lot of research, both for and against his ideas. But the neo-Freudians decidedly, moved away from the sex emphasis. Freud was preoccupied with that, and the people that came after him just said no. And even today, classic psychoanalysis does not emphasize the sexuality in quite the same way that he did, especially children's sexuality. And the other thing would be less focus on the unconscious and more focus on the here and now, the conscious mind. There's a school of thought called ego psychology, which we're focusing on ego, making sense out of what we experience, trying to reconcile, what the id is demanding and the superego is demanding. But that would be more akin to what you might see in a counselor, a modern-day counselor doing what's called cognitive behavioral therapy, focusing on what a person's thinking, what they're emoting, and what they're doing, and how well it's working for them. But not so much, what are the hidden things from your childhood that might have contributed to your depression or your anxiety or your divorce or your inability to keep a job or whatever, misbehaving socially or whatever. It's more focused on the here and now. What are you doing, thinking, and feeling? And then the third thing there would be a lot less emphasis on instinct. Freud was real big on that instinctual kind of thing, what he would refer to as the primitive things that influence our behavior. And what we're seeing is a shift away from that, murky, dark area, instinct, which is important, but it's so difficult to really identify and work with. We're looking now at interpersonal relationships. If you want to know somebody, if you're trying to get to know somebody, pay attention to how they relate to others, and it will tell you a great deal about them and the relationships that we have, how stable they are, how rewarding they are, how fulfilling they are. It says a lot about us, okay? So our interpersonal relationships are a big emphasis, and it's something that is very, very important to discuss in counseling. Carl Jung lived from 1875 to 1961, so he was, into the 20th century there significantly. And it's really important to remember that his approach to psychoanalysis is called analytical psychology. He was very philosophical. He is considered by many to be the smartest of all those men and women in that first crop of psychoanalytic theorists. He was not without his peculiar behavior, though. He spent a lot of time alone, and throughout his life he valued solitude. He broke away from a lot of the traditional ways of doing psychotherapy, which we'll talk about. But he was an odd fellow in a lot of ways. He was the first Jewish person, importantly, to be involved heavily in psychoanalysis. Prior to that, it was all Jews. So Jung kind of strode in, and because he was so smart and so capable, Freud very quickly identified that he was, an up-and-coming, and although he was 20 years older than Jung, he was a peer. He was a contemporary. He was not like his mentor, per se. He wasn't his teacher or anything like that. He was a colleague. They just happened to be 20 years apart. Sometimes literature will refer to Jung as Freud's beloved son or his heir apparent, that kind of thing, as if, he was grooming him. Well, he wasn't really grooming him, okay? Jung was on his own merits, had identified himself as an individual who was to be reckoned with. And he and Freud were best buds for about 6 years. I think the time frame that I ran across was something like 1907 to 1913, and they hung out together, and they would interpret each other's dreams. Great time, right? What do you dream? What I dream? And they would just play around with it intellectually. Two really smart guys who were into dreams and sharing ideas back and forth. But they got to where they disagreed on so much. And Freud, we already talked about how Freud it was my way or the highway. And Jung began to step away from Freud's ideas, and Freud just could not tolerate that. He had no tolerance for anybody who questioned him. So their friendship basically ended on a really bad note. They would faint around each other. I don't know what the deal was with the fainting back then, but they would get mad at each other and perceived some sort of death wish or something, and they would faint. And I don't see that kind of thing nowadays, you know. I'm so mad at you. Nowadays, people just, pull out a gun or, hit somebody.
Oh, that's a good alternate.
But that was then. And his big thing was that there are forces beyond our personal awareness and personal experiences. He said there's something, out there. There's another way of perceiving. And basically, he was endorsing Freud here, the unconscious. Some of the things that shaped his ideas were the fact that his parents, he had a very strong mother, dominant personality in the family. Father was more of an easygoing, compliant kind of guy, but they were opposites. And this somehow kind of influenced him. One of the things that he continued to develop, like Freud did, was how when we have opposites pulling together, we need to strive for balance. We need to avoid extremes. And, seek the balance. Kind of stay in the middle of the river. Don't get close to the shore. Stay in the middle. The current may pull us one way or the other, but we want to be careful not to go too far. Stay balanced. And there's words that all of them use, to describe that. But Freud's psychic determinism, or what is referred to as causal theory, Jung endorsed that as well. He believed that there was a cause for things, and when you talk to people, you can find out what the causes are. And you can see that influence, Freud's thinking there. Where he deviated significantly, though, we'll talk about Alfred Adler here today. Adler was one of the early ones to disagree with Freud, vehemently. And he came up with this idea of the teleological theory. You may remember this from Bible or philosophy. Teleos just has to do with the end, or the end justifying the means, a teleological approach to something. And basically what Adler said was that, it's not so much that what is laid down in that first 5 years is just plays out over our life and we're powerless to do anything about it. He said, no, that's not the case at all. People can have different goals. They can overcome adversity. They can overcome bad situations, and they can change the direction of their life. So, I'm not a believer or anything like that, but you can see how he's raising questions here that are diametrically, but it's almost like it's the opposite of this, but it's not really. He just kind of was moving us in that direction. Adler was moving us big time. Adler moved us more toward counseling as we know it today. But Jung's idea of psychoanalysis, he was a little bit more Freudian, really, but he was drifting in this direction because he could see the fact that the goals that we have, the ends that we have in mind, can influence what we're doing today. So keep that in mind. Those three things that shaped Jung. The opposing qualities, introversion and extroversion, we'll spend a lot of time, we'll be referencing those on a regular basis. Jung was very big on this, and these are his ideas. He came up with them. And he did not get into the fact that we are wired differently. That came a little later. There's experimental research that shows that introverts are indeed wired differently from extroverts. And again, it's not just one or the other. There's a whole continuum there. And also masculinity, femininity. That gets very interesting when you think about the goals that we have as men and women, and how some men are more masculine and macho, and some men are softer and woman-like, and some women are very delicate and woman-like, and some women are really butch, and masculine. So we've got the whole thing, but they're pulling at each other. See, think about people that you've known. Think about yourself. Where are you on that continuum? Are you Mr. Macho or Miss Femininity? I'll comment on that a little bit more here in a minute. It's not something that we want to ignore. In our society today, we've got all this stuff going on about gender dysphoria. I can't decide whether I'm a man or a woman. I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. It just gets more weird by the day, it seems. But the reality is that God created man and woman. And there are people who are biologically confused about that. And that's unfortunate. But we put a lot more emphasis on that. And right, you've heard some of the controversy in the news about who uses which bathroom and that kind of thing. It's gotten out of control in a lot of ways. But he also focused on the opposites between being rational and irrational. So you can see how he's like Freud in that he's avoiding these extremes and putting these things together and looking at the tension that exists. So he was big on the unconscious. No question about that. The personal unconscious was what he got from Freud. Like this, each of us has one, these repressed, these forgotten, subliminally perceived experiences we're just barely aware of them. We get a sense of them sometimes, and most of the time we're not aware of them. And it probably would be better that we're not aware of them, but we get a little taste of them. Again, Gladwell did a good job discussing that, how these things can kind of leak out, or the quote that I've shared with you several times already, Freud said that we ooze. We're oozing in our facial expression, in our tone of voice, in the behaviors that we choose. We are oozing. We cannot not ooze. We're always oozing. So be careful what you ooze, as I said before. Jung took it the next step, though. He said there's not just a personal unconscious, but one of the big things that Freud barely ever even touched was what Jung called a collective unconscious. And he's suggesting here that there's something that we get from our ancestors. Now, let me just say here that God created the personal and the collective unconscious. We're not deviating from the Bible here in any way. These guys are trying to explain stuff that is really hard to explain. And we know a little bit more about it today than we did then. But the fact is, there's a large body of information, this unconscious or subconscious that we have, that we will probably never understand. And that's the way the Lord made us. God made us fearfully and wonderfully. And there's some things that we can become familiar with, and there's other things that will escape us, no matter what our intentions. Going through psychoanalysis, going through counseling, going through just introspection and pondering these kind of things can be very healthy. We don't want to become pre-absorbed. It's like, for what purpose? Why am I doing this? What's my goal? We need to have something in mind there. But the collective unconscious is the one that kind of set Jung apart and really separated him from Freud. And this idea of archetypes is Jungian to the core. He came up with that. And these would be the images, the contents in our collective unconscious, the things that keep coming around, that just keep coming around. And we touched on this just a little bit last week when we were talking about literature and how Freud, in movies and the books that we read, we can see elements of themes that are repeating. There's almost always a hero in a movie that we enjoy. There's usually always a bad person. There's usually always some sort of comic relief. There's usually, various variations on these things. And when we read a story or when we watch a movie, we look for, how it's going to go. Is it going to move through and have some degree of closure? Some movies, pride themselves in kind of avoiding these traditional ways of doing things. And books, authors do this too. But typically, authors who don't honor this orderly way of organizing, situations and present it in an organized fashion, those books don't sell because we read them and we go, what's the person talking about? We usually need a hero. We need somebody who's a villain. And we need some sort of battle to go on there, and hopefully the good will win in the end. Some movies and some books, the bad people win, but usually that's not the ones that are best sellers. But archetypes, be real clear on this, okay? This is the content of our collective unconscious. And a lot of times you'll hear the word used as an adjective. When we say something is archetypal, we would mean by that, if I were to say this is an archetypal theme, like, I'm trying to think of something real good. It'll come to me here in a minute. There's various things in literature that are represented. But archetypal themes would be something that keeps coming up. We see it in all books. We see it in all movies, like the hero role, for example. That would be an archetypal theme. The villain would be an archetypal theme. If you think about the Bible and how Jesus died for our sins, Jung in describing that would say that's archetypal. Look at a lot of stories that we read, movies that we see. We have someone who is like maybe a savior-like person. They're not Jesus, okay, but they're like that in their role. Or they make sacrifices for others. We see that theme played out over and over and over. And you can see how this comes from a Platonic way of thinking. Plato, if you remember, said that our being comes from within. What's on the inside. It's a nativist approach. So he was real big on Plato, not Aristotle. Aristotle said it's the external things. that influence us and shape us. So Jung would say, no, it's really more of those things that are visceral, that are internal. They're difficult to identify and very elusive to describe, but there's so much evidence that they're there. If we look at the history of civilization, we can see themes that will recur over and over and over. We look at civilizations that are successful, there are certain things that have been done. And we look at civilizations that fall, we can see certain things that are undone there. And again, God is still the author of it all. He created all of it. These are just men's ways, these particular people here, of trying to describe some of this. So when you hear that word archetype, always think of Jung, and you can use it adjectively here to think of something that is just it's a theme that keeps persisting, that keeps coming up. And I'm going to comment some more on that. Another term I want to introduce you to, if you've not seen it before, is eugenics. Has anybody seen that word? Now, what does "you" mean as a rule when we say "you"? It means good. It means euphoric. Euthymic would be a good mood. Euphonic would be a good sound. Eugenics would have to do with heredity. Eugenics is the study of people trying to make a perfect race. This is what Hitler thought. He thought that the blonde-haired, blue-eyed people were superior, and that's why he wanted to kill the Jews. And he just had no tolerance for anything. He warned them. If you were blonde-haired and blue-eyed, you were fun. You were white. And that was part of the basis there. He liked Jung. Now, Jung had nothing to do with Hitler, but Jung said, I like this idea that there are things that go on, in cycles that persist over time. So it was a distortion of Jung's ideas, but Hitler was a fan. He liked the idea of archetype because it justified his position that blonde-haired, blue-eyed, Slavic nations or whatever they were, were superior in intellect and everything. Well, that's disproves obviously. But some examples here. The things that we dream about. If you notice, there are themes in the way we dream. We usually dream of power. We have certain fantasies. I'm being attacked. I was the victor. I was the victim. I saved the situation. I did this. I did that. So what we dream and what we fantasize about, and even delusion. Now, as a mental health professional, I can tell you, I've worked with many people with delusions, and they always tend to follow a certain pattern. Usually it's delusions of paranoia, people are out to get me, or delusions of superiority, and I'm the greatest thing ever, people with bipolar, manic type symptoms, I'm going to run for president and write a book, and I'm going to buy Sony this afternoon, I'm going to fly over in my jet, to do this big deal. Oh, really? Kind of thing. That would be, it's a power kind of delusion. And there's erotic delusions. Did you see the way she looked at me? I think she's attracted to me. Did you see the way he smiled at me? I think he wants to marry me. I think he loves me. The erotic kind of things, power, subjection, those are the kind of things that people get diagnosed with being psychotic, schizophrenia and delusional disorder. It's always the same. There's only about 4 or 5 of them, okay? They are archetypal. It's the same things. If you go to a mental hospital, it's the same thing. When you talk to people about dreams, there's always the same archetypal themes that come up. I'm a hero, I'm a villain, I'm a salvation person, I'm this, I'm that, I'm supportive, I'm comic relief, and so on. And some of Jung's ideas that he popularized would be persona. This would be what we show to others. This is the personality we put this face on. That's the one we put on when we're walking around. Hi, how are you? And then when we get back in our room or something, it's like, this one's good. So we go outside and we're dealing with the room. Hi, good to see you. What we put on, our persona. The shadow is our dark side. And we spoke about this the other day. This is analogous to believers. Our sin nature. We have a sin principle within us. It's the fall, Genesis 3. We have a dark side. This guy was an unbeliever, okay? And he recognized, he was astute enough, God gave him a little glimpse of the truth enough to see that we do have this persona we put on, and we also have a dark side that we don't show to everybody. Anima and animus would be the feminine and masculine sides. And it's a precursor to what we call androgyny today, where a lot of people want to kind of make everything unisex. They used to call it, one bathroom for both males and females, and we don't want to make any distinctions there. Cedarville is a pretty traditional environment, so you guys are probably not exposed to that much here. It's not challenged, are you male or female, and it has nothing to do with being gay or straight, but are you identified with feminine or masculine kind of thing. But in our traditional environment here, this is a pretty safe place. Everybody's expected to kind of live on one side or the other. We don't see too many people challenging that. But you hang around, you go around major cities, you'll see it. And you've all seen it. You look at them, you don't want to stare, but is that a man or is that a woman? When I was driving back, I don't know if I shared with you, but I had a long bike ride that I did this summer. Did I tell you about my bike ride this summer? Went to Wyoming, to Jackson Hole. Well, suffice to say, I rode with a group called Adventure Cycling. And there was about 12 of us, and we rode. We started off in Jackson Hole. We went up through Yellowstone, southern Montana, around the Tetons, and then we came back down Idaho, and then to Victor, Idaho, and then we rode our bikes over the Teton Pass. Anybody ever been to Jackson Hole, Teton Pass? 8,400 feet. It's 12 miles up, at a 12% grade in the last 2.5 miles, and then it's like 12 miles down. And it's a killer, especially if you're not acclimated to the climate up there. I don't want to get too far in front here, tell my story, but it was a great ride. I rode for 8 days. We camped and rode, and this organization that I went with fed us. But that last day, riding that 12 miles up, almost did me in. Because I don't live in the mountains. If you live in the mountains, you acclimate to that a little bit. But going down, I didn't brake at all, except on a couple of the curves. I got up to 44 miles an hour on my bicycle. And if you've ever ridden a bicycle, 44 feels like 120. But anyway, where was I going with that? The androgynous. I don't even remember what the link was now. But anima and animus. If you hang around out west, it seems to be a little more prevalent than here, especially the left coast, California. But who's a man? Who's a woman? What is a man? What is a woman? Where do you draw the distinctions there? And Jung kind of shed some light on this. And what he encouraged people to do is to be aware of, for guys, be aware of your feminine side.